The old man sat quietly in the third row, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. Around him, families buzzed with excitement, checking phones, adjusting cameras, whispering eagerly about who would be called next. But Paul Kim's gaze remained fixed straight ahead at the empty stage, his expression unreadable and distant. When his name was announced, the room fell into a silence so deep it felt as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. No cheers erupted. No applause filled the air. No proud relatives leapt to their feet. Just an old soldier standing alone, surrounded by strangers unaware that they were in the presence of a legend. Yet, in the back of the auditorium, 6 men sat quietly, eyes locked on Paul Kim. They knew exactly who he was, what he had endured, what he had sacrificed. Their silence held a reverence that filled the room with a quiet power. And then, as if on cue, those 6 men stood and began to applaud. One by one, the rest of the crowd followed, turning what began as a moment of forgotten sacrifice into the most unforgettable standing ovation the ceremony had ever seen. Welcome to Echoes of Honor. Before we continue with this deeply moving story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. The Riverside Community Center had seen better days. Its faded blue carpet showed years of wear, and the fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical buzz that made everything feel slightly off-key. But tonight, it was transformed. Red, white, and blue banners hung from the ceiling, and folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a modest stage decorated with American flags. The annual Veteran Recognition Ceremony had been a tradition here for over 15 years, hosted by the local VFW post and supported by businesses throughout the small California town. By 7 o'clock, nearly 300 people filled the space. Families clustered together, children fidgeted in their seats, and veterans of various ages sat scattered throughout the crowd, some wearing pieces of their old uniforms, others in simple civilian clothes with only a baseball cap or pin to hint at their service. The energy was warm but subdued, the kind of respectful anticipation that accompanies ceremonies designed to honor sacrifice. Paul Kim had arrived 30 minutes early, as was his habit. He chose a seat toward the middle of the room, close enough to hear clearly but far enough back to avoid drawing attention. At 74, he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had served him well but now reminded him daily of that service. His gray hair was neatly combed, his button-down shirt pressed, his shoes polished to a shine that would have passed inspection in any barracks. To most observers, he looked like any other elderly veteran attending a community event. Unremarkable. Ordinary. Alone. What they couldn't see was the man beneath the surface. Paul Kim had spent 26 years in the United States Marine Corps, most of it in roles that would never appear in newspaper articles or community newsletters. He had been an instructor at the most elite training facilities, a mentor to soldiers who would go on to conduct operations that saved countless lives, and a keeper of secrets that would remain classified long after he was gone. He had never married, never had children, never built the kind of family life that brings loved ones to ceremonies like this one. His family had been the Corps, and his children had been the hundreds of young men he had shaped into warriors. But those days were long behind him now. He lived quietly in a small apartment across town, kept to himself, and attended events like this not for recognition but out of respect for the tradition. He didn't expect applause when his name was called. He had learned long ago that some kinds of service go unnoticed by the world outside the walls where it matters most. The ceremony began with the posting of colors and the national anthem, sung by a local high school choir. The mayor offered brief remarks about community and service, followed by the VFW commander who read from a prepared speech about sacrifice and remembrance. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the individual recognition of veterans. The format was simple. Each veteran's name would be called, along with their branch of service and years served. They would stand, acknowledge the applause, and sit back down. Some received thunderous ovations from large families who had traveled from across the state. Others got warm but modest applause from friends and neighbors. Children waved small flags, cameras flashed, and the mood in the room grew increasingly celebratory as each name was announced. Paul Kim knew his name would be called eventually. The organizers had his information from when he registered weeks earlier. But he also knew what would happen when it was. He would stand, not politely to acknowledge the scattered clapping from strangers, and sit back down. It wouldn't be embarrassing or uncomfortable. It would simply be quiet. And that was fine with him. But in the back of the auditorium, 6 men in their 30s and 40s had noticed Paul Kim the moment he walked in. They wwere scattered across the last few rows, each attending with their own families, but their eyes had found him immediately. They wore civilian clothes, but there was something about their posture, their alertness, their way of scanning the room that marked them as military, more specifically as special operations. And they all knew exactly who the old man in the third row was. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been the first to spot him. He leaned over to his wife and whispered something, then discreetly caught the attention of the man 2 seats over. Within minutes, all 6 had made eye contact with each other, a silent communication passing between them. They were Navy SEALs, members of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. And the man sitting alone in the third row had trained every single one of them. Paul Kim had been their instructor at advanced combat training facilities that most people didn't know existed. He had pushed them beyond what they thought possible, broken them down and built them back up, and given them the skills that had kept them alive through multiple deployments. More than that, he had been a father figure to young men who were far from home, learning to become something most people couldn't comprehend. He had been patient when they struggled, uncompromising when they needed discipline, and proud when they succeeded, even though he rarely showed it. But none of them had seen him since their training days ended. They had gone on to their units, their missions, their own lives and families. They had assumed he was still teaching, still shaping the next generation of warriors. They had no idea he was living quietly in retirement, attending small-town ceremonies where no one knew his name or understood what he had given. The ceremony continued. Names were called, applause rose and fell, and Paul Kim waited patiently for his turn. The 6 SEALs in the back watched him, each lost in their own memories of a man who had changed their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Petty Officer First Class David Chin remembered the day Paul Kim had pulled him aside after a particularly brutal training exercise. Chin had been ready to quit, convinced he wasn't cut out for the program. But Kim had looked him in the eye and said something Chin had never forgotten. The difference between a good soldier and a dead soldier isn't strength. It's the willingness to keep thinking when everything goes wrong. Chin had carried those words through 3 combat deployments and was now training the next generation himself. Senior Chief Marcus Williams remembered the night Paul Kim had sat with him in the hospital after Williams had been injured during a training accident. Kim had stayed until the doctors cleared him, never saying much but making sure Williams knew he wasn't alone. Years later, when Williams was wounded in Afghanistan, it was that memory of quiet support that had helped him through the darkest moments of his recovery. Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez remembered how Paul Kim had never raised his voice, never needed to. There was something in his presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Rodriguez had tried to emulate that quality throughout his own career, and it had made him a better leader, a better SEAL, and a better man. Each of them had similar stories, moments when Paul Kim had appeared at exactly the right time with exactly the right words or actions. He had been more than an instructor. He had been a guardian angel in military fatigues, watching over young men who were learning to carry enormous responsibility. And now he was sitting alone, waiting for his name to be called to an empty room. The announcer reached the K section of the alphabet. Sergeant First Class Jonathan Kane, Army, served 1995 to 2010. Applause filled the room as Kane stood and waved to his family. Gunnery Sergeant Paul Kim, Marine Corps, served 1969 to 1995. The words hung in the air for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Paul Kim rose slowly from his seat, his back straight despite his age, his hands at his sides. He looked neither left nor right, just stood with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. And then came the silence. Not the respectful quiet that precedes applause, but the uncomfortable absence of sound that happens when a moment falls flat. A few people in the room clapped politely, the scattered acknowledgement of strangers who knew nothing about the man standing before them. But mostly there was just the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of feet as people looked around, waiting for someone else to start the applause that would make the moment less awkward. Paul Kim had expected this. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement of the modest response, and began to sit back down. This was how it always was for men like him. The work was done in shadows, the recognition saved for others, the applause reserved for those whose stories could be told in public. But then something extraordinary happened. In the back of the auditorium, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres rose to his feet. His movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, and the sound of his chair scraping against the floor caught the attention of several people nearby. He began to clap, his hands coming together with a sharp, rhythmic precision that cut through the ambient noise like a drumbeat. Within seconds, Petty Officer First Class David Chin was standing beside him, his own applause joining Torres's. Then Senior Chief Marcus Williams rose, followed by Chief Petty Officer James Rodriguez, and then the other two SEALs whose names weren't on any public records but whose lives had been shaped by the man now standing confused at the front of the room. 6 Navy SEALs, men who had faced enemy fire in the most hostile places on Earth, were giving Paul Kim a standing ovation. Their applause wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was thunderous, sustained, and filled with the emotion that began to spread through the room like wildfire. People turned to see who was making such a commotion. They saw 6 men in civilian clothes, but there was something about them, something in their bearing and intensity, that made it clear this wasn't casual appreciation. This was recognition of the deepest kind, soldiers honoring a soldier, warriors saluting a warrior. The applause began to spread. First to the families of the 6 SEALs, who didn't understand what was happening but could see it mattered. Then to other veterans in the room, who recognized something in the quality of the ovation that spoke to shared experience and mutual respect. Then to more and more people, until nearly the entire auditorium was on its feet, clapping for a man they had never heard of but who clearly meant something extraordinary to the 6 men who had started it all. Paul Kim stood frozen, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been emotion. He looked toward the back of the room, trying to understand what was happening, and his gaze found the 6 men who were leading the ovation. It took him a moment to recognize them. They were older now, filled out, bearing the confidence of men who had tested themselves in ways most people never would. But he knew those faces: Torres, Chen, Williams, Rodriguez, and the others whose names came flooding back to him as 30 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. His boys. The young men he had trained and worried about and sent into harm's way with nothing but his best efforts to keep them alive. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in ceremony time. People who had been checking their phones were now wiping away tears. Children who had been fidgeting were standing still, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't understand what. Finally, the 6 SEALs began to make their way forward through the crowd. They moved with purpose but without urgency, letting the applause continue as they walked down the aisles toward the front of the room. Paul Kim watched them approach, his own emotions playing across his face in a way that suggested he was fighting to maintain the composure that had defined his entire career. When Torres reached him, he didn't salute or shake hands. He simply spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the room as the applause finally began to fade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words cutting through the settling quiet, "I need you to understand who you're looking at." The room fell completely silent. Even the children stopped moving. "This man," Torres continued, placing his hand on Paul Kim's shoulder, "trained all 6 of us. He has no family here tonight because he dedicated his life to creating us. He gave up everything, marriage, children, a normal life, to make sure we would come home alive from places you'll never hear about." The other 5 SEALs had reached the front now, forming a semicircle around Paul Kim like an honor guard. "Today," Torres said, his voice thick with emotion, "we're his family." What happened next was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever witnessed. The 6 SEALs, as if responding to an unheard command, came to attention and rendered a slow, ceremonial salute to their former instructor. Paul Kim, his own military bearing taking over despite his surprise, returned the salute with the same precision he had taught them decades earlier. The salute held for 10 seconds, 20, 30. In that time, the room was completely still except for the sound of people crying. Not just family members or other veterans, but hardened adults who had been touched by something they couldn't fully explain but could absolutely feel. When the salute finally ended, Torres stepped forward and embraced Paul Kim. Not a handshake or a pat on the back, but a full embrace between men who shared bonds that civilian language couldn't adequately describe. The other 5 followed, each taking their turn to hold the man who had shaped them into who they had become. The ceremony organizer, who had been watching from the side of the stage, wiped his own eyes and made a decision. Instead of moving on to the next name, he stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of what everyone had just witnessed, "I think we need to take a moment to understand what we've just seen." Gunnery Sergeant Paul Kim served 26 years in the Marine Corps, much of it training the elite forces that keep us safe. He never asked for recognition. He never sought the spotlight. But tonight, we've learned that some of the bravest men in our military consider him family. He paused, looking out at the crowd, then back at Paul Kim, who was still surrounded by his former students. "I think that tells us everything we need to know about the kind of man he is and the kind of service he gave." The applause began again, but it was different this time. Not the polite acknowledgement of a name being called, but the deep, sustained appreciation of a community that had just learned what real sacrifice looks like. Paul Kim stood in the center of it, no longer alone, surrounded by men who had never forgotten what he had given them and who had just given him something in return, the recognition he had never asked for but had always deserved. The ceremony continued, but the energy had fundamentally changed. Every subsequent veteran received more enthusiastic applause, as if the room had remembered what it meant to truly honor service. But nothing matched the ovation for Paul Kim, the man who had entered as a stranger and left as a legend. After the formal program ended, Paul Kim found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, thank him for his service, and hear his story. The 6 SEALs stayed close, serving as informal translators for a man who had spent his life working in shadows and didn't quite know how to handle sudden visibility. Torres explained to anyone who would listen that Paul Kim had been more than an instructor. He had been a father figure to young men who were far from home and learning to do impossible things. He had pushed them when they needed pushing, supported them when they needed support, and believed in them when they struggled to believe in themselves. He never told us he was proud of us, Chen added during one conversation. But he didn't need to. We can see it in the way he prepared us, the way he cared about every detail of our training. He knew we were going into danger, and he made sure we were ready. Williams talked about how Paul Kim had visited him in the hospital after his training injury, staying late into the night to make sure he was okay. He didn't have to do that, Williams said. It wasn't part of his job description, but that's who he was. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, the 6 SEALs gathered around Paul Kim one more time. They exchanged contact information, made plans to stay in touch, and promised that he would never spend another ceremony sitting alone. They had found their instructor, their father figure, their family, and they had no intention of losing him again. Paul Kim, who had arrived at the ceremony as he had lived most of his life, quietly and without expectation, left as something different. Not changed, exactly, because the core of who he was remained the same, but recognized, appreciated, no longer alone. The old soldier who had spent his life creating warriors had discovered that those warriors had never forgotten him. And in a moment that lasted less than 5 minutes but would be remembered for years, 6 Navy SEALs had reminded an entire community what it means to honor those who serve in silence. Sometimes the most important applause comes not from family or friends, but from the people whose lives you've touched in ways you never fully understood. Paul Kim had trained hundreds of soldiers over his career, but he had no way of knowing how many of them thought of him as family until 6 of them stood up in a community center and showed him exactly what his sacrifice had meant. He had given up traditional family to create something different, a legacy of men who carried his teachings into the most dangerous places on earth and came home alive because of what he had given them. He had traded personal recognition for the quiet satisfaction of knowing his work mattered, even if no one would ever see it. But sometimes, just sometimes, the shadows give way to light. Sometimes the forgotten soldier gets remembered. Sometimes the standing ovation comes exactly when it's needed most, from exactly the people who understand what it means. Paul Kim had never asked for applause. He had never needed it. But when it came, thunderous and sustained and filled with the kind of love that only exists between people who have shared something profound, it reminded everyone in that room what real heroism looks like. It doesn't always wear medals or march in parades. Sometimes it sits quietly in the 3rd row, content to be forgotten, until the people who remember what forgetting would cost refuse to let it happen. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who gave everything for others and expected nothing in return? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their sacrifice shaped your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.